Welcome to the Whitmer Cast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Colby, and I'm currently a PhD student in the English department at Indiana University Bloomington, studying colonial and early national American literature. I'll be your host for today's episode, and thank you for tuning in. We have a great episode lined up for you. We'll be talking to Mark Staker. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and JWHA journals, go to jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Mark Staker. He received his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Florida and is a master curator in the Historic Sites Division of the LDS Church History Department. He has written a wonderful book, Hearken, O Ye People, the historical setting of Joseph Smith's Ohio Revelations, published by Greg Koford Books. And then also this more recent book that we'll be talking about today, Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm, an Archaeology and Landscape Study, which he co-authored with Donald L. Enders. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad I can talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have you here. I'm excited to talk to you about this book. But first, I'd like to just take a little bit of time to go over your background, kind of what led you up to writing this book and the previous one. But yeah, do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Not at all. I started out in college very interested in archaeology, wanted to be an archaeologist. I had some very dynamic professors in cultural anthropology that directed me that way. I loved everything that they taught and attended all their classes. And so I ended up becoming a medical anthropologist, went on through school, got a PhD from the University of Florida, which is very strong in that area and in Caribbean studies. And so I went to the Republic of Suriname, and did my field work there for a year with the Nengre, the Creole population there, and had a research grant that I received and focused on them and their lives. But at the time, I also learned a lot about the Hindustani, the East Indian population that lived there in Suriname, and the Javanese, the Indonesian population, very culturally diverse peoples that live there. And it gave me a real sense of kind of the worldwide setting. And so after I got out of graduate school and was looking for work, this opportunity opened up at the Museum of Church History and Art in Salt Lake City. And I'd not really thought about that before, but they were interested in somebody dealing with 20th century international Mormonism, and it just fit with something I found very compelling. And so I was hired by the museum, and over time kept getting lots of assignments to do 19th century subjects and earlier, and eventually became a curator in the Historic Sites Division. And so I've spent almost 30 years focusing on the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mormonism in general in various contexts, but especially the early period. One of my colleagues, Don Enders, that I worked with for a lot of years, he's now retired, and he spent 60 years studying the Smith family in early upstate New York. And I spent 30 years kind of following in his footsteps, building on what he'd learned, trying to learn new material. And we decided to collaborate, to pull together our research and write a book on the Smith family in early New York. As we talked together, it became clear that to understand the family in New York, you really needed to understand them in Vermont. Yeah. And to understand them in Vermont, you needed to understand them in Massachusetts, because each element of the story played on later elements. And so we got a research grant to allow us to go out to Massachusetts, where we studied some of the homes there built by family members and looked carefully at the setting, and continued on up to Vermont, where we were able to continue that and did just a couple of days of archaeology on one of the, well, let me step back, that there's a great little article in a book called The Sacred Places, where Larry Dahl, a professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, he has a little black and white image that you can't really see well, and he's kind of pointing to the ground. It says, here's the foundations of the home where Joseph and Lucy Smith first lived. Mm-hmm. And that didn't match with other things that you saw, because there's a well-known image that George Edward Anderson had taken of what he labeled the Hiram Smith birthplace site.
Right, yeah.
And you look at the mountains in the background and the setting, and that is not the same place. And so we weren't really sure if Larry Dahl had gotten the right spot or not, and we weren't sure what this other site was or how it related. And so those were things that we were interested in, and just the general story of the Smith family as a whole. And so we were there and spent a few days and confirmed that this site that Larry was looking at was a very early site. The family that lived there, Scott and Patricia Beavers, two marvelous people, gave us permission to go on their property and to look at this site. And so we learned enough that we knew we wanted to come back and look at it carefully. And we were able to get another research grant. Mm-hmm. Archaeology is a very expensive effort.
Could see that.
It takes a lot of time to do. And so we weren't quite sure how we were going to pull this off, but did lots of meeting with people, phone calls and things, found some marvelous friends now, people that we got to know. Euclid Farnham, who was the town historian for Tunbridge, Vermont, very helpful. Bob Dunkel, who owns an Airbnb there in town, and he let us stay for free to support our research, and a long list of others, volunteers who helped come and join in on the dig. A family that was on vacation saw us down there working, stopped, and they spent their vacation helping us. It was a fun experience, and lots of kids came because I wanted to do a feature article for a kid, the Friend magazine, on this site, and so we trained them, and they carried buckets for us. They didn't do any of the real digging, but helped a little bit just so that we could kind of feature that. And so we gathered all of these people together, and including many more I didn't mention, and we're able to, in a short period of time, excavate that site. And just focused on the foundation, the inside of the foundation, and it was probably about 6 inches. It might have been a foot. The book gives the exact measurements, but it was just a little bit around the outside of the foundation as well. We didn't want to get out too far because we didn't have the time and the resources. We wanted to leave that for later archaeology, and we were hoping, and I still hope, that what we've uncovered is compelling enough that it fosters additional research on this site so that more can be learned about the family. And
definitely.
So we focused on that site and learned what we could.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. I think one of the striking things when you first start going through the book, you always hit the acknowledgments. Sometimes recently, I think I've noticed a few, monographs and other books where the acknowledgments will now be in the back. But most of the time, you encounter the acknowledgments at the front. And a lot of the time there's some sort of witty quip or some sort of turn of phrase or something like that that sort of starts off the acknowledgments. And, there's always famous stories about some scholars saying, yeah, no, if there are mistakes in here, then, others should have told me, jokes like that. And yours is incredible because it really created a sense of community for this book. When you first get the book, it's kind of a lot like, an archaeological report. It's a little bit smaller. It's packed full of information. It has a lot of, very, very helpful notes at the end. But the acknowledgments are actually acknowledgments. You jump right in and you thank all of these different people. And it's just right from the beginning, it sort of sets the scene for the whole book.
Yeah, we are very much indebted to a large group of people for the work we were able to do. We couldn't have done it without each of those people. It's not like a research paper. You can say, well, I think this archives and this university and so on. And had one of them not come through, you probably wouldn't have a detail or an aspect of the project. But for ours, every player was essential in helping pull this together.
Right. Yeah. So let's see. I was curious too. When was the first time that you and Don went and visited those areas and started, sort of garnering the relationships with some of the people there?
It was the year before our primary research. I put the dates in there.
You do have them in there.
Me to remember some of that.
Maybe around 2015.
It might have been that, and I should remember because my mother actually passed away while we were there the first time, so I had to come home 2 days earlier. She's been gone for 5 years, so yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I think if I'm remembering, I will be honest, I do not remember the exact dates, but I remember 2016 showing up, and I don't remember 2017.
And I should remember the exact dates, but it's been a while since I've done that. And as you know, anything like this, it takes a lot of time to pull together and get out. And so it's
Well, and it's I think what you're saying too is so clear when you read it, because you were only there for a couple of weeks at a time, or a week or so at a time, and you dug right into the ground. You did what you needed to do. And then after that, what was the process like for both you and Don writing the book together?
Well, I wrote it all. Don was my intellectual mentor. Mm-hmm. And, he was there with the dig, and he knows so much about the family. It helped. But I did all of the primary research and tracking down, what each of these artifacts meant and contacting a specialist. We had an osteologist who looked at our bones for free, to tell us what they were, and others that helped. And so Don read it a few times along the way, gave some input, and was remarkable in terms of his intellectual capacity in helping kind of think it through. But I did the work on it.
Okay, that makes sense. I was going to say it is written as just in one voice. So it really comes across that way. But you can tell that just decades of research are behind it at the same time.
A lot of research beforehand, and then a lot afterward as we came back. There's a photograph of the foundation that I came across afterwards. It would have helped us immensely beforehand. It was taken in 1907, early, I think June 1907, and it just told us so much, and things like that we found afterwards. So continue to do work on it. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. And I was curious too, as I was reading through, at certain points in the book, you refer to either the chapter or maybe the book as a whole as an article a few different times. Was the earlier conception of it going to be more for a journal? Did that sort of develop as you went?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning, we're working on a larger book together. And wanted this available so we could cite it. This is a footnote to a larger project.
Yeah.
And so I contacted John Whitmer Historical Association and wanted to publish it in their journal. I sent him a copy of it, and it just was too long for the journal. And I've encountered that others end up cutting that way short. I've got another piece coming out soon that's about less than a quarter of what it was initially. But they were very gracious in saying, well, hey, why don't you turn this into a book? Just a short book, a little monograph on the Smith family in Tunbridge. And so one thing led to another, and worked with John Whitmer Books on it and published it with them as a book. And so it was going to be just an article, but I think it works great as a book, as a standalone piece, and is more accessible, I think, to a wider audience that way, because not everybody gets the journal.
Right. Yes. No, I'm actually very happy that it ended up going this way. And I wasn't sure that, sometimes the terminology, article, book, or those or chapter, sometimes those are sort of, flexible. But yeah, no, I'm very happy to be able to have this on my shelf, for one. And rather than just having it, in the journal or, whatever else, because it is only 70 pages long, but it feels like it's a lot longer. Like there are pages where you might have 5 or 6 end notes. And I spent myself a half hour on that page, going back, flipping through, slowly making it through the end notes. Like you have a couple of pretty long end notes too, that were really fun to sort of dig into, kind of think about where all these different, moving parts are at in the archives, or sometimes in your own personal files. I thought that was really fascinating too. The personal files, if any scholar or interested reader came across some of those sources, did they just reach out to you, or are those in the archives at the LDS
They can reach out to me. That a lot of it I've been trying to get put into the Historic Sites Division. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints we have a big section of filing cabinets that we've kept over 50 years worth of work on our historic sites. And they're independent of anything else. They aren't a part of a library or an archives or anything. They're just our division collection. And we've put materials in there as well, so that it's available primarily to people interested in historic sites, and but other scholars could get access to it as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. Because there were quite a few end notes as I read where I was like, oh, that would actually be interesting to look into that a little bit further. And a lot of them were, in your possession. So I found that really fascinating. I'm curious too. So the book itself starts off and goes in sort of a chronological, the whole thing goes in chronological order. Starts off with Azael and Mary Duty Smith, and how Azael essentially first moves in and starts buying up lots, and ends up buying up quite a few. I was kind of surprised by that. Actually, I didn't know really anything about that.
It's a whole little settlement that comes to be known as Smith Settlement. Azael and Mary start the settlement in the site that we actually ended up digging on. It's theirs before Joseph and Lucy Smith moved there. But then he moves off the site, meaning Azael and Mary, and then their sons get property around them and are marrying, and it expands into a larger community. And that's all important to this story.
It is, and it becomes Smith Settlement because they're the first ones in the area.
They are. There are some other people on the property before there's a massacre. The British, during the Revolutionary War, send a whole band of Native Americans down into that area to attack the settlers. And they attacked what is today South Royalton. It was Millville Mill Village at the time, and killed a lot of people. One of their stations where the Native Americans settled, or not settled but camped before they go down, was on this property. And so it's got a history before the family settles there, and we try to address that as well in the narrative. And then it has a history after they leave. We don't deal with that. Just there wasn't time and space in what we were doing to do that, but we do deal with the before.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that the Smiths or anyone in the area were a little bit nervous going in, knowing that background story?
Absolutely. And I think that's why they were able to get the land at such a good price. People weren't really interested in settling there at that point after the massacre. This is not many years later that they're coming in. The land's not prime land, wetlands. Call for a pollen study in this book.
Right.
Ended up doing that after, and I can comment on that later, but it kind of says some things about those wetlands. And so not really good land to begin with, but so all of that plays into their getting the land for a good deal, but the massacre certainly was a major part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Because, it seemed like Asel was able to just, he purchased quite a few acres at the beginning, and then he just sort of kept purchasing, just kept going.
Each of their sons, and that's it was part of their culture, part of the setting that to marry, you would, you needed to have a property and a proper home for your bride to bring her in. And they have a lot of sons that they're trying to get to that marriage stage. I'm thinking in Kirtland, Ohio, for example, Neil K. Whitney wants to marry Ann Smith. He moves from Michigan to Ohio and works for 5 years to get a home for her to move in. Who would do that today? Wait 5 years for the house. You're going to move in with mom and dad in the basement or something, which is what Joseph and Lucy actually end up doing. They move in with Joseph's parents, who are there for a year while they're building their home. And and then they're trying to get the rest of the property for the other sons to do the same thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it just seems like, the timing was right in the 1790s for that. It seems like it was a little bit better than, 15 or so years later, as far as the economy was going.
The whole economy right after the war, as part of the war, the Revolutionary War, the economy had collapsed everywhere, including here. But it picks up not long after, which allowed them, in theory, to pay off the property. They do some things, mortgage it and end up losing it all. But had it all gone according to plan, they would have been all comfortable and had this whole little community of their own family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I found it really interesting too, trying to describe the types of homes that they built. It was almost like they would build these really small, little ones you describe. I can't remember his name, but the little boy walking into not one of the Smith huts, but someone else's, and I think it was his older brother or something like that. And he just cries, just seeing.
Yeah, Elijah Smith, but he's not a relative,
right?
It's the same last name, but they're in the same area. It comes in, and a real tender story. But John Smith, Joseph Smith Sr.'s younger brother, gives almost the same account, but not as dramatic with the crying part. But he comes in, their home is built well, ready for the family, but he sees it and he cries. Keep in mind that most of these people none of the people down in New England have seen a log home yet. We tend to think of log homes as, early America. That's what the Pilgrims came and, Plymouth and built, and that's not what they built. It's not what the Puritans built in, Essex County, where the Smith family settled. It's something that they get from perhaps Scandinavian, perhaps Native American kind of combinations. And so this is a new thing for them to see these log homes and learn how to build them. And so that's all part of this story as well.
Right. Yeah. And I found that fascinating, kind of, for me, at least with my training and, the things that I read and engage with in early American literature, thinking about Gilmore's Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life. I don't know if you're familiar with that book at all, but he describes how, in the region at the time, I think I'd have to look at exactly the years. I think he goes 1750 to 1830 or so. But his argument is in his title, that in the area, reading literally became a necessity of life because, you were snowed in for so much of the year that if you didn't have books and you didn't read, what else could you keep your mind occupied with? Maybe conversing with family or other things. But if you're just sort of in these little houses, it becomes difficult. And so I kept kind of trying to, take some of that and, get the imagery, because at one point, I think you described the early Smith home as possibly just having a hole in the roof for smoke to go out.
they had no place to sit in there when they first got in, and there's not enough room for everybody to lay flat on the floor, given the dimensions of the home, the number of people that are in there. So that confirms in our mind that they didn't have a hearth, just a hole in the roof. Probably the next spring into the next summer, they had that built. And the bricks are really roughly made. You can tell that Joseph and his brother Jesse made those, some fingerprints on them, and, not fully fired. So that first winter, there was no room for anybody to read anything, and no books. So they were spending their time outside working in the bitter cold.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that is how they spent their time the first little while, couple of years. Yeah.
Certainly the first winter. By then they've been able to expand the home and make it a little more comfortable. And after that, and then put food away. They have a cellar in the basement of the home that they expand, and so they can put food aside for the following winter and get themselves through a little easier. I'm sure they still didn't have much time for reading for some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, with all of that work and just having the little home, they probably spent a good chunk of that just trying to make the inside a little bit more comfortable if they could, besides going out into the cold. It's just difficult, I think, for me at least, to kind of imagine doing that and trying to sort of keep yourself occupied throughout that winter, because it's also that the region is really intense in the winter, right?
It is. At that time, not quite so bad as later on. By 1809, there was some climate change, and 1815 is famous with the volcanic eruptions that impacted that. But so 1809 to 1815 is really bitter cold, but it's cold beforehand. Just like today, it's still cold in Vermont during the winter. Difficult times for them.
Yeah, definitely. We could always talk about the cellar too. I found that really fascinating. The objects that you found there, the way that you describe it as sort of also, I don't know if it's boosting the value of it necessarily, but just that expansion on the back of the home and how they were able to sort of dig. And was it covered, or am I remembering that wrong?
Yeah, the cellar is underneath the home, the main home, and so. They've dug it out after there's an initial cellar. They dug down deeper. And I can imagine it was partly because the Smith family is so tall. A really shallow cellar was not easy for them to access. But what it left a ridge around the edge.
Right.
And I was familiar with that same phenomenon of the John and Elsa Johnson home in Ohio, where they used it to make cheese. It was where their cheese press was, and they used their basement. Theirs was a rocked-in basement, but to make cheese. And so we assumed, I assumed, this is what they're doing here, is making cheese. A dairy. It's a dairy area now. Lots of cows. Mary Smith had lots of cows they brought up from Essex County, Massachusetts. It made sense, but I think we've learned that maybe they were doing other things in there as well, but I think probably still cheese was a major effort for that cellar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you found a few artifacts in the cellar?
Found some artifacts, a fork that dates to the 1760s time period, about the time that Aisel and Mary were married. Mm-hmm. And that's usually when you got your flatware eating utensils, and so we're assuming it was a wedding gift, but we don't know. But they could have bought it, on an auction somewhere. But so that early piece, lots of ceramic fragments, a few metallic items, and bones.
Yeah.
We found some dinner bones. The bones were found outside of the foundation. They had been tossed out of the home and kind of knocked up against the foundation.
Mm-hmm. And those bones were mainly or mostly from deer?
They were all from deer.
All. Okay.
3 different deer, which suggests, that that was the main element of their diet. Puritans actually had, they looked down on hunting kind of activities, and fish they disdained because that was a Catholic thing. It seems kind of silly to us, but they look down on fish. They look down on some kinds of food, of hunting. But deer for Puritans was seen as luxury item. Mm-hmm. And coming from England and the royal access to the deer hunting fields and so on. And so this suggests that, in addition to the ceramics, that they were living in luxury. Mm-hmm. And which is one of the big surprises of our research. Scholars have been saying increasingly more and more, Joseph Smith Sr. was very poor, started out poor, mm-hmm. struggling financially, just was not a good economic manager, and on and on. But it turned out that the ceramics were of a family living really comfortably. Mm-hmm. Right. High-end items. Some of them were royalty level items. Things imported from England. So some were local Vermont pieces, but a lot of it was not. And then the food was high-end, luxury items. And so mm-hmm. it suggests that the family was doing quite well.
Right.
Aethel, he's a selectman, which, New Englanders will know what that means, but for others, it's like the mayor of the mm-hmm. town. He was one of 3 individuals that helped run Tunbridge. A prominent position. His son Jesse became a selectman and held other political offices. So they are respectable people, doing quite well for their area and their time. Even though it's a log home, everybody has a log home. Until they get the sawmill in 1805, started expanding. So.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That does seem like a really big transition in studies, like just in Mormon studies. Like it usually is that the narrative of Joseph Smith Sr. had a little bit of money, but then the whole ginseng, debacle really just threw everything out the window, and whatever little bit of money he had before, he had none after that.
Yeah. So this was a real insight, a different perspective, and it puts the ginseng experience kind of in a larger context. And that's a whole nother story, but mm-hmm. but it helps to kind of set that up and what happens with the family. So.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting moment in the book too, because you sort of bring up the ginseng story, but then you say, well, we'll tell that later.
It's hard to separate all those. That's the article I mentioned that was a really long one mm-hmm. that's been cut way down, slated for publication next spring.
Perfect.
And so that's coming out, that part of the story, and hopefully people get to see that in detail too, because that's really important. The whole story continues on in importance later on. There's some elements of that that'll play into the whole New York story.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And I'm curious too, on this note about the Smith family actually having a little bit more money than we would have assumed beforehand. Jesse is an interesting character in this story too, far more than I would have expected. Near the end of the book, you describe how, he starts to mortgage, and there's just a lot, what chapter is that? I think chapter 5, just a lot of selling and mortgaging and doing second mortgages. And so it's the selling Smith settlement. It's actually chapter 7. I was way off. And Jesse seems to be in the middle of all of that. And I was kind of like, okay, there's going with his, father-in-law, doing all these, these different shifts with selling different, parts, trying to raise money. And then just kind of out of nowhere, he's allowed Azel and Mary to, live on 20 acres, I think, and live. Is it a cooper shop?
This is a cooper shop on there. It's a 100-acre farm, but he gives them 20 acres of it and let them live there. But there's controversy about that. Azel and Mary feel like he's taking advantage of them, and he seems to think that he's being generous. But it's hard to know how that actually played out.
Yeah, and then Jesse sues them.
He threatens to. Well, okay. No, Azel. People suggest he ought to sue Jesse, and then he decides not to. But
Okay. Yeah, so I had that switch then. All right, interesting. Yeah, just that whole controversy as it came up was like, oh wow, I I did not expect to see that, and I guess it was Jesse was sort of waiting because he was, I guess, waiting for Azel to pass away, and then he'd just sort of take.
He was going to let him live there, and then until he was gone, and then it would be his property. Yeah. One of the interesting things that I found in all this was how closely associated the Smiths were with very, very wealthy people. Jesse Smith, he marries into the Peabody family. This is the most important shipping family in America at the time. They practically own Salem, Massachusetts. The Peabody Museum that's there, or I should say Peabody for those who are locals, but it is inherited. It comes through their family, or was created by their family, and he's very much involved in that. That's who he's getting his loans from. Yeah. But he has relationships with John Jacob Astor up in Canada, which is part of his business, and that becomes important in the later ginseng story because it turns out that's a big part of that story. And then when the family moves to East Randolph, Joseph and Lucy, some of their neighbors who are shopkeepers become the largest importers of groceries and other things in the country. So they move to Chicago, and so these are big, influential, wealthy families that they're interacting with over time, which is we tend to think of them as backwoods kind of yokels, isolated from the mainstream, and they were not.
Right. Yeah. Especially living out where they did. Living on the farm and all of that. Yeah, I think the assumption generally is that, they probably didn't know that many people. It was just whoever happened to live in their neighborhood or, in the area. So it's another huge sort of insight from the book. And I think it's fascinating also the role that religion plays in this, because I guess generally the assumption has just been that, Azel was a Universalist, and his having a seat at, was it a Baptist congregation?
Congregational.
It was a congregational.
He owns a pew in the Congregational Church, right?
Yes.
But he's people have misinterpreted that over time, assuming that means he's a Congregationalist. It was a Union church. Mm-hmm. So the Universalists were attending and owning pews as well as the Congregationalists, and the Baptists also.
That's where they
were attending there as well. But they were Universalists before they ever arrived in Vermont, and we're very much involved in that. And I think, I didn't say this in the book because I can't prove it, but I think that they're the ones that bring Universalism to their community because they're so involved in it early, and it's just it appears in the area right when they come. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you kind of hint toward that.
Speculations.
And I think that's also an important moment, not just for sort of the development of religion in the area and the variety of different religious groups in the area, but also the role that he plays in bringing people together. Because I guess there was some sort of agreement that he helped with to make it so that church would be more than just congregational.
It looks like he was actually the selectman at the time, in charge of the town.
Yeah.
When they decide, people are protesting, well, we don't want to fund your church, but they decide, oh, this is a Universalist church and everybody can go to it. And then he buys a pew in it, clearly wanting to support this church effort, even though he's not a Congregationalist or / Presbyterian, because they become Presbyterian very quickly after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just far more networking and getting to know everybody in the area and bringing people together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is so much information that we don't have time to cover in this, just all of the digging and all of the different parts and the moving pieces. I was really fascinated as well with the amount of either archival manuscripts or even just, published materials that I had never seen pop up before in Mormon studies, books and journals. Just letters from Jesse, or just, references to them in a variety of different histories published maybe in the 1840s or the 1880s. How was it tracking down all of those? Was that something that you and Don had done in the years leading up to this, or was this?
Some of it was done before and some after, but it's part of this larger looking at Vermont carefully, and it helped kind of explain what we were finding in the archaeology. So we tried to pull all that together too.
Yeah. Well, I was sitting there, just myself as, a PhD student in an English program, kind of like, I wonder like what kind of tips you would give for finding some of those. I usually use Google, I use HathiTrust, I use, as many different, databases as I can to try to find those kinds of things. But what was your process in locating some of these?
Boy, looking at anything published in Vermont from that time period in that area, a major effort of looking through a lot of stuff, going to all the archives in the area and seeing what they had. Just look, it involved 95% chaff to find that 5% of wheat. It was a lot of just filtering through things.
Yes. As we do with with archival materials. But so that's a good point of entry though. So it's really kind of just looking at it and saying, okay, these are the dates that I want to look at, and I'm just going to find kind of anything that I can, either published or in the archives manuscripts from that period.
Sure, that was a major. Talking to people who had, I mentioned Euclid Farnham, the township historian. He didn't know any additional sources, but he knew so much about the town's history that he raised a lot of intriguing questions that then allowed us to go looking for it. Say, okay, that could be an issue. Let's look for that. And we were able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. So that's another thing for historians and, students of literature and just anything in the early Republic, go and make friends with the local historians.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He's the one that mentioned, hops was the first cash crop in the area. And we had this issue of looking at the Smith property and knowing Lucy Mack Smith in her family memoir says that after they got married, that she and Joseph went to cultivating the land. And we spent some time in the book talking about how do you study land. And I shared a lot of details about how you go about doing that because I knew that that's not anything that any of our readers would have done before. And so I try to say, okay, what do you look for in the land to know how it was used before? And that we could tell this had not been plowed a lot, maybe once or twice. And so if they're cultivating the land and not plowing it, what are they doing? And that's where we assumed that probably hops, because that's the first cash crop in the area. It's brought up from Massachusetts. They could be the ones that brought them up. Others, they brought them up, but they knew how to grow that. And so that was probably what they were growing there. And indeed, so I suggested in a footnote in the book, well, we really, somebody needs to do a pollen study to confirm this hypothesis, but we think they were growing hops. And so we got some funding. And we were able to have that study done, and indeed we found hops pollen in the little industrial building, the little factory that they had, which confirms that it was an oast. It was an area used to dry hops as part of their work.
That's perfect. Yeah. And is that the building that you described near the end of the book, the two-story?
It is. Yeah, there's a chapter we put on that, trying to figure out what that building was. We had not even planned on looking at that. Scott Beavers, the owner of the property, said, hey, there's another foundation over here. I noticed just off in the trees. Trees had grown up around there. You wouldn't have even known it was there, but of course, it was his property. He'd been over it all very carefully. And so we, had a couple of days where we designed a quick study where we were able to get the dimensions of the building and establish then the foundation. We had to actually, Scott and Patricia Beavers took the dirt samples for us because we'd already finished the archaeology. And so we gave them careful instructions. How do you do this? Get to the floor level, describe what that would look like. And they got those and sent those. And that's how we were able to get that study done.
Yeah. Community again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, this study was done by a lot of people.
Yeah. No, that's great. And for that building too, none of it is still standing, I assume, just like the house.
Right. That building was gone soon after the Smiths left. Actually, the house was probably gone soon after they left, as based on the evidence we found. But and so it was very, very protected, and grown up. The grass had grown up over it and had covered it, and but it was just the foundation.
Yeah. And I bet as, an archaeologist, that was kind of like, striking gold in a way, because, you mentioned a couple of artifacts that I think some of the people involved had found little bits and pieces of things here and there out of context. But as far as, digging into the foundation of the home, going through everything, finding the fork, finding the ceramics, all of that is in context. And, you're working directly with that as an archaeologist. So
context is essential. If you don't have context, you can't make any sense of it. And so,
yeah. And I think that's incredible, to be able to have that, because, most of the time, like in Mormon studies, we don't really have something like this, an archaeological report that really has like a little time capsule in the dirt, and you're able to report on it. Your report is authoritative now moving forward. For anyone who wants to engage directly, with the actual Tunbridge farm, this is where we'll be turning to understand, exactly what was there and what the family was doing.
Most historians have just ignored the archaeological context. We're hoping to change that. As a matter of fact, John Whitmer Books now has a whole series coming out on archaeology of these sites, because there's been a lot done over time. Different scholars that have done that work are going to pull that together, and I'm excited to see what comes of all this.
That'll be amazing to see that. And particularly this, you get a sense of, okay, I'm going to keep this on my shelf for decades and I'm going to be turning to this a lot in the coming years. But then at the same time, it's not finished. It's not a finished project or in a way product either, because you're already adding to it, even though it was just barely released. You've done the new pollen study that you mentioned in the book. So, you are still, adding to it as you go. And I'm really excited to see the larger project, the small, essays, or maybe not any more little books like this. I don't know. But yeah, really excited to see.
We'll see what develops of that, but probably not any more books, but maybe. So we'll see.
Yeah, that'll be great. And I just really appreciate this kind of work. I'm really, I'm grateful to have been able to chat with you today and to go over, all of these details. It's really fantastic to see this kind of new, and it really, in a way, a new chapter in Mormon studies, because if we're really returning to this kind of material artifacts, right? The material culture, and like really digging into that kind of information, you get more of the context. You get more of what the real lived experience was for the families. And this is, wonderful not only in Mormon studies, but it's also going to help, I think, tremendously in early American studies, having this kind of, archaeological work. I was also really excited as I read through the book and saw the endnotes, all of these more like recent archaeological studies on like New England and, other things like that. So opening sort of this totally new world in a way to Mormon studies scholars, I think is fantastic.
Good. I hope it does.
Yeah, great. But was there anything else that you wanted to discuss about the book or your future work that you're working on now?
I'll just share one real quick story.
Yeah.
That as we were doing our work, there was a land developer who had bought a lot of the property out in that area, and the whole town was really upset by that, and it made people really skittish. We were interested in the Asel and Mary Smith property that they had moved to, and so we'd gone up there and talked to the woman who lived there, but we were trying to figure out from a 1797 survey of the land that had begun at Asel and Mary Smith's home, so we could confirm that we were at the right spot. We were around we had a 100-foot tape measure and trying to reconstruct that, and it was making people nervous. And so this woman, her grandson was over visiting, and he came out with a gun. I'd like to say a shotgun, but I didn't look close. But he came out with a gun.
Oh, no.
And we were up kind of on the edge of the property, and he ran us off with that to stay away from their land. And it's understandable that they were a bit nervous about this developer and what's going on. And so that was an interesting part of the study that we hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
The final night of our time there, we had a little bit of time, and we went. There was another family up across the road living in a trailer home up there. And I knocked on the door, and there's this famous picture I mentioned at the beginning that George Edward Anderson took in 1907, where he says Hiram Smith was born here. And we've been trying, asking everybody around the area, where is this place? Because he, somehow he missed it.
Yeah.
And as I was there, the sun was going down, and on his doorstep, I showed him the picture, and he said, well, I don't really know where that is. And then the light dawned on him. And he said, oh, it's right there. And he pointed over our shoulder, and we turned around and looked out, and you could see that home where the young man had run us off with the gun was the same place that's featured in the photograph. And there was the family property. And so George Edward Anderson had photographed Asa and Mary Smith's property. Mm-hmm. When we were able to figure that out, that gave an illustration of the homestead and the cooper shop where they were living, and an additional part of the story that we had not even thought we'd be able to tell. Yeah. We were able to tell, that last night because of that fortuitous question that we had asked that last person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sort of the two experiences coming together too, being run off and
finding out that it was more important than we had even thought.
Yeah, and I love that. So the cover of the book includes that image,
it does.
And that image itself is actually the home that Israel built.
That is, yep. That image. The cover of the book is the Asa Mary's property. This is the whole Smith family property, and where Silas, their son, when he got married, lived in the Cooper shop. We don't go through all those parts of the story in the book, but that's all. It's a major part of the Smith family story.
Mm-hmm. And so that home lasted well over 100 years, and it might have, after George took that photo in 1908, 1907, it probably only lasted a little while longer. It's not still there, I assume.
It burned down in the 1960s.
Okay.
So it lasted clear up until then, and then it was rebuilt on the original foundations. And so that's why being able to talk to that woman that lived there before she passed away was really helpful, because she could tell us about her memories of the childhood in the home details. Mm-hmm. And so it's gone now, except for the foundation, but it lasted for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's immense, actually, to think that it, from, I guess, the 1790s all the way up until the 1960s for that home, or?
1797 up until the 1960s. So it was used for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And Joseph Sr.'s probably only lasted a couple of decades, or if that. It was much more roughly built, but it would have been 1791 up until probably, by 1810 or so, it's gone. Okay. It's always interesting how some things can, they seem like they just continue to last, and others just disappear into the grass, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
Joseph Sr.'s burned as well. You mentioned the 2-inch layer of ash and
burned down, probably intentionally. The family that bought it after them probably, they didn't want their cattle breaking their legs in there. Mm-hmm. The family was moving and leaving behind better homes, and he just he set it to fire, burned it down, and nobody occupied it after that. Yeah. So I also, find it really interesting. In the end, there's, the switch from sort of this archaeological, report to the last, what would that be, 10, 15 pages or so. It's kind of more of a close reading of Lucy's history. There's quite the abrupt switch. And it's actually kind of fun to go from, more of the report
to then, okay, let's actually talk about, Lucy's religious experience there, how it was with her family and the death of her two sisters.
It is an abrupt switch and kind of because we focused on the home and the homestead earlier, but it's an attempt to apply that.
Yeah.
Say, okay, now we know this story that Lucy tells us. Anybody that's read her memoir knows, the outline of that story. But she's talking about this grove of trees and this brook and this field and everything, and they're right there.
Right.
She's talking about her land and her property, and it wasn't until we did that careful landscape study that we were able to say that this is all here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's a close reading of her memoir, but then also applying it to the landscape. So I love that, how it comes in archaeology and landscape study. It's all there. So yeah, I'm really excited about this book and your future projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah, you've been very gracious with your time. We really appreciate it. So once again, we'd like to thank Mark Staker for joining us today and lending his voice and expertise to the ever-growing field of restoration studies. You can find him, let's see, actually, we should probably keep some notes on that. Like, how would people reach out to you? Just through email, or do you have social media?
They're welcome to email me. I don't have a web page or anything. You can find me on Facebook, but you can also email me. It's called, I have a Gmail account under Revised Edition, but it's spelled a little bit differently. It's Revised Addition, ADDITION,
nice.
2, TOO.
Okay.
So but you're welcome to email me there as well.
Okay. We'll see if we can add that into the show notes. But yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to engaging with you more in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. Love to talk to you again.
We want to thank you for tuning into the Whitmercast. This podcast is produced with the help of Bryce Blankenagel, Catherine Pollock, Jill Brim, Joe Geisner, Catherine Hill, and Rachel Killebrew. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution with Kristen Mackay as our president. For more information, visit jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of the John Whitmer Historical Association, copyright October 2021. All rights reserved.